Okay, so after looking at the forms and actors of the sciences in several socialist states, then analyzing the way these societies propose a definition of the normal and the pathological, the aim of this third session is to analyze, to study other uses of the psi-sciences in socialist regimes. So the three papers will insist in different types of uses of this knowledge and practices, this set of knowledge and practices in socialist regimes in Europe. The first use of the psychological sciences makes them tools for the education and orientation of socialist subjects. It is the question of shaping the socialist self, and this will be the concern of Verena Lembrock. Verena, I hope you are there. You are a researcher in history of science at Erfurt University, and you are also currently a fellow at NEAS Amsterdam, and you will speak first with a paper on East Germany. There is also a second use of these psi-sciences, use as tool of knowledge in a curative perspective, especially towards subjects that do not correspond to the ideological profile in these societies. It is, I think, in this sense that Frank Henschel, who is currently working at Christian-Albrechts-University Kiel, at the Department for Eastern European History, will intervene. He will be the second. Frank is a specialist of the history of psi-sciences, childcare, and family politics in post-war Czechoslovakia. And there will be a third use of the psychosciences. This use is to consider these sciences as a tool for emancipation, especially of women, closely linked to a project for the protection of the socialist order through family stability. And this will be described by Lisa Dittrich from Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. She will analyze how the psychosciences have been able to contribute to the emergence of a concept of partnership, and also to the consolidation of a more egalitarian couple, or a culture of egalitarian couples. She will talk about the couple culture in East Germany. So I give the floor first to Verena Lembrock, and then we will hear Frank and finally Lisa. So please, Verena, if you hear me, that's now your turn. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to present my new project, which tackles the subject of psychological expertise under state socialism on the basis of a case study. And the case study is about social psychological leadership training in the German Democratic Republic in transnational context. I'm very open for feedback at this stage, so please let me know what you consider relevant in this project and what you think is boring. So the leadership training emerged in the late 1960s within the framework of a form of Marxist social psychology established in the early 1960s at Jena University. The behavioral training was designed for socialist leaders in the party, the administration, education, and most dominantly in industry. It aimed at transforming styles of communication and leadership in order to improve human cooperation at the workplace and ultimately to raise economic productivity in the working collectives. So in practice, the training sessions took place in groups, in isolation, over 2 or 3 weeks away from all-day work life and family life in a kind of boarding school setting. In terms of methods and techniques, it drew from social psychology, especially group dynamics, and from psychotherapy, especially group psychotherapy, and there are lots of parallels to Melinda's research, which she has presented this morning. Behaviors supported in training sessions were, for instance, spontaneous and emotional reactions, empathy, openness, authenticity. At the same time, dysfunctional social behaviors were to be destabilized in the group process through feedback and through best practice examples, so-called Orientierungsgrundlagen provided by trainers. This intervention flourished throughout the entire existence of the GDR and in fact beyond. It is fair to say, I think, that it was the largest applied area and research area of GDR social psychology. Contrary to this historical relevance, historical scholarship has so far largely overlooked it. There's a few articles and there's also one dissertation on social psychology. They have been written in the 1990s, and they do, in my view, misinterpret the training as a national phenomenon connected to GDR industry and disconnected from global trends. So now what I want to claim is that the opposite is the case. At the Soviet All-Union Congress of Psi Disciplines in 1971, the president of the All-Union at that time, Boris Lomov, defined the increase of labor productivity as a prominent new field of applied psychology, because the greatest economical reserve lay in psychological and social psychological factors, according to Lomov. And at this point in 1971, the GDR social psychologists had already published on the subject, including the social psychological leadership training. They were quite ahead in this field. Yeah, you can see this is the first publication on the leadership training. It contains a chapter on methodology by Manfred Vorwerk, who was the leading figure, and who introduces in this chapter a theory of role play, as well as different techniques, especially psychodrama. And historians of psychology of this period are well aware that psychodramatical role play is primarily associated with Jacob Moreno, who by the time was in his early 70s already, and a guru-like pioneer of group dynamics applied to psychotherapy. He developed a form of group psychotherapy performed on a stage. Oh, I thought I had it. There's a little picture of the psychodrama stage in New York City. So now Vorwerk not only refers to central notions of Moreno, that is creativity and spontaneousness, and he also introduces the psychodrama as a key technique. We also know that he worked extensively with sociometry before, and had also engaged critically with Moreno before in his Habilitation. But at this point in time, when when this book is published, he obviously had to omit the intellectual inspiration. So there, he doesn't mention Moreno. Yeah. And then you have a stark contrast if you compare the archival records to the official publication in this case, because we get a quite different picture taking a look at Jena University Archive. In this case, for instance, with a bunch of letters between Moreno and Vorwerk, which show that they knew each other in person, met in person and exchanged letters. Vorwerk was a trusted Marxist scientist, allowed to travel to capitalist countries and to forge networks, which he did. And what we can see is that Moreno acted as a gatekeeper in several ways for Vorwerk. This letter in particular shows that Moreno sent his journal to Vorwerk regularly, and Vorwerk informs him that it had arrived as usual. And what is also interesting Vorwerk naturally describes the behavioral training for leaders in the GDR as part of one of the same movement, and that's the movement of group psychotherapy, sociometry, and psychodrama, led by Moreno. So what I find interesting is that this connection, Vorwerk-Moreno, is not a fact that the second generation of psychological trainers remembers, at least not the authors of the articles that have been published in the 1990s, from which you get the impression that the social psychological training was an invention of Manfred Vorwerk and something only existing in the GDR. So, and apparently what is also, what I also find interesting is that this Moreno connection has been tolerated, if not supported, by GDR authorities, as well as the methods used in training, albeit in a kind of hidden and relabeled manner. And maybe this marks a slight difference to Melinda's Hungarian actors, who apparently had to escape a little more to unofficial spheres, or in a different way at least. So what follows from this in a more global perspective? If GDR training was transnationally entangled, albeit in surreptitious manner, one has to consider, I guess, the Western developments, such as the human relations movement and management theory, T groups, sensitivity training, self-awareness groups, and what have you, the general spread of psychological practice into society at large in the West, and particularly in the long 70s. And one thing I am struggling with entering this field of research now is the question if the existence of phenomena such the GDR management training lead to questioning some of the well-established interpretations about about the social function of psychological expertise in Western societies. For instance, the idea that applied social psychology was in a substantial way a science of liberal democracy, as Nicholas Rose has claimed a time ago, and I'm not sure if this claim has been affected by 10 years of research on sciences in communist Europe. Apparently, the psychotechniques involved in leadership training were much more polyvalent and globally circulating than traditional Cold War narratives would let us assume. They were used to shape selves in their relations to others, regardless from the political system. And a plain assumption could be, I guess, that Eastern European scientists imported liberal conceptions of the self by adapting these techniques drawn from approaches popular in the West, from humanistic psychology and psychotherapy. And yet, it feels this does not paint the whole picture, I guess. What is reflected by Western academics and public discourse in the 60s and 70s concerning applied group dynamics, especially in leadership training, is that it could turn out as a technology of conformity as well as of non-conformity. So you've got in adherence, describe T group and sensitivity training, very popular management training in the 1960s, using terms like rebirth, self-knowledge, self-fulfillment, personal growth. And then at the same time, critics call T groups brainwash, group pressure, manipulation, totalitarianism with a friendly face. This dualism or opposition of self-enhancement and fulfillment versus repression of selves marks a tension which seems to be inherent in group processes and in psychological interventions based on knowledge about groups. And this is very much captured, I guess, in the post-Foucauldian concept of technologies of the self in the context of liberal governmentality and governmentality studies. It applies to GDR leadership training quite as well, I would say. On the one hand, the official publications are, not surprisingly, marked by a largely technocratic and sometimes also cybernetic vocabulary, and the presentation of leadership training as a planned way of shaping leaders, shaping compliant behavior in leaders for the sake of the common good. On the other hand, the methods and techniques applied were quite obviously drawn from Western approaches, which carried individualistic and liberal overtones in Western psychology. Existing statements of GDR trainers reveal what training meant to them vis-a-vis an authoritarian state and society. One trainer I talked to recalls that the aim of the training was to soften up narrow hierarchical structures from within, to humanize interpersonal relations, and to strengthen the democratic element in a centralist management culture. And there's also a singular recent article by anthropologist Susan Cohen about social psychological training in Russia. She calls Vorwerk an Eastern Bloc guru of the Russian training community, which emerged from the mid-1970s onwards after Vorwerk, with his colleague Traudl Alberg, had given some intensive instruction to social psychologists in Moscow and Leningrad. So what Cohen's research article shows is that not only that Vorwerk was perceived as a guru, it also states that the Russian training community understood social psychological training as a means to a limited and at the same time, quote, deeply felt reform of social relations. And these findings connect well, and Cohen also connects them, to recent literature about subcultures, dropout cultures, and forms of subjectivation in the period of late socialism. But unlike movements such as yoga, punk, or pacifism, one has to bear in mind that GDR training, and the Russian training as well, I guess, was not denied or persecuted by the state. It was also not as informal, I guess, as the group psychotherapy groups in Hungary that Melinda presented today. I'm not sure. I would like to hypothesize, nevertheless, that it carved out a space where to experience oneself in unusual or new ways of sociality. And from this perspective, one might argue that it had features of a subculture, even a counterculture, within official structures. Yeah, one last remark. What are the available sources? As you can see, I'm at the beginning of the project and I've just applied for funding for it. So I haven't looked at most of the sources yet, but I just tell you what there is. Publications, of course, archival records from Jena and Leipzig universities. There's also unpublished research material as well as training materials and videos in private hands. So I hope I can get a hold on them. Then there's document of the former companies. And here I will focus on Carl Zeiss Optical Industries. There are the surviving trainers, of course, I can talk to. And some of them are still practicing today within private institutes on the free market. Then there is a large body of stately files from the science department at the Central Committee of the Communist Party I have not had an eye on. And finally, there are also the files of the Secret Service. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Verena, for your presentation. So I give the floor now to Frank Henschel.
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you all for being here also on a Friday afternoon with nice autumn weather here in Kiel, like see in the forest behind me. What I'm talking to you about today, the title might promise something different because I'm not talking about an Marvel-like epic fight between a British psychologist and the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. But rather I will talk about the hopefully not least interesting story of how psychologists evaluated and influenced the setup of extrafamilial childcare in socialist Czechoslovakia during the first 3 post-war decades. So to speak, this is more the art house version of the relationship between scientific knowledge and state policies. What I want to show in this very short amount of time is first how Czechoslovak psychologists since the late 1950s developed new perspectives on children's emotional, psychological, and social needs by studying their living conditions, in particular in residential home institutions, and by adapting approaches and concepts from Western scholars of developmental psychology and psychoanalysis, like René Spitz, William Goldfarb, Mary Ainsworth, and particularly John Bowlby for their research. So second, I want to show how psychologists in the 1960s then turned those altered perceptions into criticism of residential home institutions for causing emotional and mental disturbances in children. And third, I want to show that although psychologists contradicted the regime's original preference for residential care for children without the family, those psychologists were not only supported by a growing number of scholars from other medical and pedagogical disciplines, but also achieved significant changes in the legal and institutional design of care provisions. Interestingly, during the era of so-called normalization after the defeat of Prague Spring. And fourth, so to say, apart from those particular considerations, I would like to promote the inclusion of both, of course we all do this here, but the inclusion of sciences and socialist societies into the historiography of scientizations in the second half of the 20th century. And the plural is important here because just as historiography assumes that there are multiple modernities, there was, to me, no uniform pattern of scientization or expertization in all modern societies. Perhaps you can also speak about a psychologicization or so of socialism. And just as modernity does not simply work as antagonistic term to tradition, but always modernity means dealing with tradition, scientization does not work as the antagonistic term to ideology or to lay knowledge or other forms of knowledge. Rather, science always relates to and incorporates other forms of knowledge, and science can turn itself into an ideology. And in the socialist regime, I want to show that it was neither free from ideology nor simply under the thumb of the party, not even perhaps in Stalinist socialism of the 50s. So this is all I have. Just a small sheet with my structure, what I will talk to you about. So first, some brief remarks about state child care in the 1950s. I don't know. Oh no, the animation is not working here. Now. Regarding the establishment of extrafamilial childcare in post-war Czechoslovakia and the role of scientific experts in general, I identified 2 peculiar momentums that mirror the rearrangement of state and science after 1945. The first momentum was the nationalization of children's homes in 1947, when the still democratic state overtook responsibility for orphaned and abandoned children from charity, church, and public providers, which had organized orphan care for decades as part of poor relief in the region. Doctors and pedagogues widely appreciated this takeover for introducing a centralized and monitored network of home institutions staffed with professional caretakers to provide age-adequate material care and education. The second momentum was the abolition of foster care in 1952. A commission comprised of ministry officials as well as experts from pedagogy or pediatrics regarded foster care as an outdated provision. Their final report stated that foster families would not provide adequate care or education to children, but they exploit them for work, they keep them away from schools, they mistreat or even abuse them. This report was followed by a law instructing that all foster children who could not return to their birth parents or are eligible for adoption have to be transferred to residential homes that affected thousands of children. Thus, in the 1950s, in the early 1950s, both the communist politicians and the scientists firmly believed in residential childcare as an adequate substitute for the family, especially when they regarded the birth parents incapable or overburdened. The state scientized residential care by organizing children's homes according to medical expertise, which had proven successful for decades in fighting disease, malnutrition, and mortality of children. In the first place, children were seen in need of a clean space, sufficient nutrition, and some educational activity according to their age. This view indeed also prevailed in other European societies beyond the Iron Curtain, but there it was challenged since the 1940s. Psychologists and psychoanalytics observed the occurrence of emotional disturbances in hospitalized children and researched the causes and consequences. In Britain, the evacuation of thousands of children from the cities, separating them from their parents during the bombings by Germans, turned out to result in an increase of psychological problems of children. One of the most prominent experts to analyze those cases was a British psychoanalyst, John Bowlby. He used findings from his US-American colleagues like Spitz and Goldfarb, who themselves had coined the concepts of hospitalism and emotional deprivation in institutionalized children. And Bowlby added his own research on lost and abandoned children in post-war Europe to develop his theory of attachment. In very short, this theory said that a child needs the most a stable and intimate and fulfilling relationship to a parent, usually the mother. Bowlby saw a connection between the early and extended separation of a child from its mother and the later emergence of personal disturbances and even delinquency. His work was popularized by a report for the WHO, which was published in 1953, reaching several editions until 1965. The reception of his ideas varied. Claudia Meusel, a historian from Germany, has pointed out that social and sciences in Western Germany perceived Bowlby in a rather negative way as an apologist of traditional gender roles. In the British context, though, his expertise soon inspired social reforms and laws for child protection. In Czechoslovakia, then, Bowlby arrived in the late 1950s as an idea, as his knowledge. Apparently, his observation of a connection between psychological trauma and social deviance contradicted the positive future prospects of the regime, which at that time was convinced that it will soon overcome all social problems and free society from scarcity, poverty, and crime. Following a simplified quotation from Marx saying that the social being determines the consciousness, the Communist Party rejected any biologization or psychologization of social relations. Most experts of natural sciences and medicine, but also from pedagogy, supported this concept and developed truly scientific, that was the materialistic perspectives on men, on children. Thus, psychology and psychoanalysis were rather unpopular after 1948 and even regarded with suspicion due to their bourgeois or revisionist worldviews. However, during the second half of the 1950s, the discipline gained influence in a new position, in particular regarding the educational and care conditions of children in state institutions. What happened? Repositioning of psychology. There were several reasons for the rise of psychology in post-Stalinist Czechoslovakia. First, it provided convincing empirical insights into the development of children. Psychologists and social workers were routinely tasked to examine the social, mental, and psychological conditions of children who were taken away from their parents in order to determine into which type of children's home those children should be admitted afterwards. The standardized setup turned children's homes into laboratories of psychologists who had the opportunity to directly study children in residential institutions and to research their families and their living situation. Second, psychology offered new explanations for social and educational problems, which were not simply withering away during the building of socialism. The scholars placed the mind of the man, in particular mind of children, in the focus of attention. In 1959, the publication of the book Člověk známý neznámý, The Man Known Unknown, by two young psychologists, Zdeněk Matějček and Josef Langmeier, introduced the international state-of-the-art in developmental psychology to a professional, but also to a broader audience. They underlined the importance They underlined the importance of adequate educational and care conditions for children's development, particularly in the early years. With strong reference to Bowlby and other colleagues, they consider the family as a primary educational and care environment and emphasize the relevance of functioning parental relations in order to raise psychosocially healthy men and women. And third, psychology responded to alarming problems that concerned the regime in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Not only Matějček and Langmeier, but a growing number of experts and doctors from different disciplines stated the emergence of a crisis of childhood and family that accompanied and amplified the general economic and political crisis of the decade. What followed from this repositioning of psychology? I would like to elaborate some of the mentioned aspects by giving some examples and consider the psychological shift in the scientization process of state childcare more detailed. As stated before, starting in the mid-1950s, psychologists, but also doctors and pedagogues pursued studies in institutionalized children to reassess the performance of residential homes after the expansion of the system. Rather unexpected, the experts became aware of the true dimensions of children's social, psychological, emotional, and behavioral problems and the deficits of care and education in families, but also in the institutions themselves. Residential institutions gained particular importance because the expert recognized several structural deficits and shortcomings. Studies noted an increased risk for mental retardation and school failure in children that were admitted in long-term institutional care compared to children in normal families. During the years, so in late 50s, early 60s, an increasing number of similar studies focusing on the harmful effects on long-term residential childcare, but also of manifold problems in families, raised alarm of an imminent crisis of childhood. The work of Bowlby and other Western psychologists provided a central reference for Czechoslovak psychologists and doctors in analyzing and coping with the crisis. This reference, however, was neither simply negative nor positive. For example, the medical doctor and head of a home for infants, Maria Dąbrowska, in one of the first studies in residential homes in 1957, indeed recognized that children tend to suffer from certain problems and developmental retardations, as described by Bowlby. But she refused to obtain a pessimist view and explained that the bad results of Bowlby's studies were due to the poor level of collective childcare beyond the Iron Curtain. The Czechoslovak system might not be perfect at the moment, but the medical care, as well as the educational program, will succeed in preventing problems in the near future. Matějček and Langmeier referred to Bowlby not only in Člověk známý neznámý, but also in several articles and books. In their second seminal work, Psychická deprivace v dětství, first published in 1963, they mention Bowlby nearly 50 times. A particular reference is made to what they see as his main thesis, namely that a child, especially at an early age between 3 and 5 years, needs an intimate relationship with one person, primarily the mother, and will suffer from institutional education. Against this point, nevertheless, they point out two important specifications. First, the deprivation through emotional neglect is not limited to institutional environments, but also occurs in families. And second, that the consequences of deprivations are not uniform, but there are several ways in which children respond to this condition, some more serious, others less. The aim of the psychologists was to recognize problem children and to provide them with educational and therapeutical support. Thus, developmental psychology in Czechoslovakia promoted differentiation, prevention, and intervention, a claim which in the end fit well with the new governmentality of the late socialist regime. This governmentality of normalization was built on a multifaceted set of techniques in education, care, social and psychological support, which were actually developed and negotiated during the 1960s. As already indicated, Maciejczak and Langmeier, but also other doctors and educators, were highly engaged in promoting a reform of extrafamilial childcare, referring to both the experiences in Western countries and their own research. However, there was no univocal call for change, but different camps of experts struggled with each other, and they were organized around disciplinary lines. While pedagogues were rather defending the status quo in children's homes, psychologists and pediatrics urged for reforms. This controversy was not limited to expert circles, but carried out publicly. For example, this is the last point here. For example, in 1963, when Maciejczak participated in the documentary film Děti bez lásky, Children Without Love, which depicted the everyday life in residential institutions in rather great colors. So we have a picture of that here in my presentation as a background, a screenshot. Although the movie was banned, it raised additional awareness for the emerging crisis. From the mid-1960s, several plans were published in professional journals and were discussed in ministries that argued for improvement or even radical change in the system of extrafamilial care. In 1965, Maciejczak, Langmeier, and their colleague Jaroslav Koch published a proposal that anticipated the cornerstones of reforms put into action after 1968. They demanded the reintroduction of foster care and the promotion of adoption as alternatives to residential care, the establishment of family-like home institutions with smaller age-mixed groups and constant teams of educators to whom the children have a stable relationship, and the prevention of family problems by establishing a network of counseling offices and financial and educational support for families. So to conclude, the final reform concept issued by the Ministry of Education in 1970, in most part reads like a realization of this proposal transferred into the new governmentality of the normalization regime. After a decade of controversy and discussion, this process ran surprisingly smooth, most likely because the rather traditional perceptions of childhood, family, care and education promoted by the Husak regime met perfectly with the child and family-centered demands of the psychologists. So I would argue that we can question the caesura of 1968, at least also in this realm of society. The Scientization of state childcare in socialist Czechoslovakia did not result in positioning Bowlby against the KPC, but rather to adapt Bowlby for the KPC. Thank you very much for your attention.
Now I give the floor to our last panelist, Lisa Dittrich from Munich.
Thank you very much, Jérôme, and thank you for inviting me today to speak here. Especially I'm thankful because actually I'm talking from a quite different perspective than a lot of you have done. I'm talking more or less from outside, from society, and then coming back to sciences. I have the task now in a couple of minutes to grasp your attention again after quite a long day. And I heavily rely on the subject that I'm talking about, that is couple relationship and marriage. And I guess that everybody has some notions of the problems which can arise here. And the first, I want to start with a quotation. In the past years, we have somewhat distanced ourselves from each other, an excess of work on my husband's side. We have not really known a family life with time for each other yet. Nevertheless, our life is not empty. It's not that we have nothing to say to each other. On the contrary, We are ideologically on the same ground, complementing each other in a way that is seldom the case between two spouses. I help him with his studies. My husband came and still comes to me with all his worries, his enjoyments, and experience of the day. We consult each other about everything, exchange opinions, and are so happily united about the state of affairs of our political, economic development, educational questions, etc. Only one thing has always been a poor relation for us. We have never been really happy with each other. In this letter, one woman sketches out the model of good marriage in the DDR in 1962. And yet there were reasons why she wrote the well-known marriage counselor Rudolf Neuberhardt. Her husband had started an affair. She therefore was struggling to find explanations why her marriage, although close to the ideal, did not work. She saw the reasons in their infrequent sexual activity and in a lack of sentiments. The good and stable marriage conflicted with emphatic feelings such as joy or love. How to solve this conflict between stability of marriage and the individual's search for self-fulfillment and love occupied spouses, marriage counselors, and other family experts, as well as politicians in the DDR from the end of the 1950s till the fall of the wall. In the following, first I want to show that the attempts of the politicians and the experts to solve these conflicts have changed over time. The focus here is on the concept of partnership, which has been developed since the 60s as part of an overall more open attitude towards marriage and family. The concept of partnership offered a space for development for the socialist personality and at the same time was intended to help to realize individual demands for self-realization in love. Secondly, it is made clear that new forms of influence were developed. The emphasis was no longer on the domination of the private sphere, but rather by means of conflict management techniques. The individuals themselves were to ensure the stability of the relationship. As a result, more subtle forms of influence came to prevail, similar to those in the West. The planned talk will present the first results of a larger project in which the question will be also investigate what influence the psych sciences have had on the culture of couple relationship in both German states and what exchange processes can be traced here. In the following, I will concentrate on negotiations between politicians, marriage counselors, the controlled media, as well as spouses in the GDR, showing how the concept of partnership fluctuated between empowerment and subjection of the socialist personality. The related debates in sciences are only roughly indicated because I'm still at the beginning of the project. Sociological and historical value change studies on the DDR have shown that the concept of socialist lifestyle, propagated since the 60s, offered some room for individual self-fulfillment. A special proposal was made for individual development possibilities in relationships, partnership. At the same time, this ideal of good marriage was to guarantee stability in the face of changes. During the 60s, partnership became the key term for relationships in East Germany. According to the debates in the advice pages of women magazines and daily newspapers, partnership was the framework in which individuals could continually develop into socialist personalities and in which they received support for their individual development. The Family Act of 1965 guaranteed gender equality and both men and women the right to develop their abilities for their own and social benefit. In the new model, partnership became a recurrent task of the spouses and aimed at a new labor market policy. In an expert discussion on marriage, the University Lecturer for Ethics at Humboldt University, Helga Hertz, explained. Marriage, this is often ignored, is a task for both partners involved. This results in the subtask of helping each other in their future further development and feeling responsible for each other in such questions as well. The support to enable development primarily referred to the male help in the household and female employment and was located in the context of efforts to attract and retain women in the labor market. The labor market policy in the early GDR initially aimed to integrate women into paid employment in general. In the 60s, a major qualification campaign was launched, in the context of which the marriage partnership model was adapted. Since the traditional responsibilities did not change much with regard to the family task, in spite of the partly codified equality in the Family Act, a problem arose in face of the labor market policy, of which the people were increasingly aware. In this context, the concept of partnership was particularly aimed at the promotion of women's careers. But despite the utilitarian orientation of the concept, it seems important to emphasize that the concept of partnership created an enabling space for individual development, especially for women's career, within the framework of socialist society. Moreover, the concept of partnership was also an enabling space for love, and at the same time was intended to contain the longing for love. In order to explain this connection, I have to explain briefly the development of the ideal of marriage and ideas of love in the DDR before the 60s. In the first years in the DDR, the ideal of good marriage as propagated on the grassroots level in the discussions of marriage counsels, consultants and spouses was mainly based on the idea of marriage as mutually complementing of each other and was to guarantee stability. Support implied a certain degree of equality without being asserted in the concept of gender equality. The image of an ideal marriage was linked to the agreement of the spouses in ideological questions, mutual complementarity of the character, the sharing of concerns and joys and coping with problems together, the joint building of a home or of a career, as well as the spending time together. Basic norms were understanding, harmony, consideration, loyalty, and faithfulness. However, there were cracks in the consensus between counselors and those seeking advice by the end of the 50s. The discrepancies from the ideal image of mutuality were articulated in letters in which women and men talked about their flings or affairs and those of their partners. The letter writers fell back on the ideal of love marriage already installed by the state, but they modified it. The Marriage Code from 1955 had fundamentally reorganized the legal framework for marriage and based marriage on love. In the letters about the infidelities, the central points of reference was the romantic concept of love, which was seen as a domain of self-fulfillment, including sexual fulfillment. This stood in contrast to the state's concept of marriage that aimed for reconciliation between love and marital stability. Stability was secured by the divorce law, which made possible to dissolve marriages without having to have absolute grounds for divorce, such as adultery, for example, but at the same time incumbent on the courts to examine whether the individual marriage lost its sense not only for the spouses, but also for society. Shifts can be seen in the approach to the topic of love in letters of spouses written between the late 50s and the early 70s. Above all, the letters of the late 50s and early 60s demonstrate a struggle with a possible decision against a specific marriage. Those seeking advice ask whether they could give in to their individual desire for emotional and physical satisfaction, contrary to their responsibility towards their spouse and children, or towards the institution of marriage and society. The letter writers at the end of the 60s, wrangling with the idea of a possible break, assert their right to pursue their happiness. I don't have a bad conscience about the whole thing, although I think a lot about whether what I'm doing is right, especially towards him. But I still think that I'm a little bit right about what I'm doing. Why should I give up the other man who really brought me some sunshine into my life again, to whom I look forward, on account of whom I can be cheerful again and enjoy many things again? Partnership could offer an answer to these individual self-realization demands in love. At the same time, it stood in the context of a more open approach to marriage and family. From the late 50s until the late 80s, the East German leadership struggled with continuously rising divorce rates. Nevertheless, there is evidence of a tendency to open up the focus on stable marriage as the goal of family policy. With the Family Act of 1965, the reference of marriage to society was softened. In the divorce law, the social purpose of marriage was now, unlike in 55, classified as a consequence of the purpose for spouses and children, thus strengthening individual reasons for separation. Shifts can also be observed in the attempted influence on people seeking divorce. Since the 50s, pressure has been brought to bear on people seeking divorce to abandon their plans and change. This type of influence was officially codified in 1955 in an attempt at reconciliation in the procedural law of divorce. Its implementation changed over time. Since the Family Law Code from 1965, the solution was sought in the collective, with the aim of exerting more pressure on the party wanting to separate through superiors, colleagues, and neighbors in order to achieve behavioral and attitudinal changes. In the 70s, such direct influence was increasingly abandoned. Moreover, the legal practice and the marriage counseling reflected this change in the 70s and the 80s. Marriage counselors and legal courts accepted emotional problems and individual wishes as grounds for divorce. The state and the family experts thus increasingly accepted that individual feelings decided upon the future of marriages and families, and thereby empowering individuals. At the same time, at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, the East German leadership began to deliberately promote marriage with the establishment of marriage schools, matchmaking institutes, the promotion of marriage counseling centers, and educational measures. The concept of partnership took up both of these tendencies. Partnership was seen as the realization of true love, and at the same time, it was also used as a way of containing the explosive power of love. This can be seen in numerous letters from readers about their problems and the responses of journalists in newspapers and magazines. True love matures, is beautiful, and proves its worth when it's shaped by the noble human relationships that are characteristic of our socialist order, by comradeship and helpfulness, by mutual respect and sacrifice, by mutual understanding and trust, by the meaning and the purpose that both give to their lives, by the work on themselves to be wise and a good companion to their partners. Marriage counselors and columnists referred, as in this quotation of the editors of the women magazines For You, to the concept of mature love, which was set against passionate romantic love. Mature love was based on a good knowledge of each other, on respect, trust, helpfulness, as well as sexual relationship. In the concept of partnership and mature love, working on marriage played a central role. As early as the 50s and in the 60s, Neubert and other authors of marriage guides had already drawn on the idea of education in marriage and of development. Solutions for conflicts were seen in a constant adaptation and the renunciation of some personal needs. Discussions between the spouses about possible conflicts were regarded as important, but initially one should always first consider whether a hard word is necessary or whether it would be better to leave it unsaid. A different way of dealing with conflicts became increasingly apparent in the 60s. Dialogue as a central form of socialist social management also became important in Neubert's marriage counseling letters and in the relevant pages of the press. The new recipe was a rationalization of the handling of emotions. The aim was to become aware of one's own feeling and to control them. This different form of dealing with conflicts was part of an increasing spread of ideas of self-management, which was based on a new form of thinking about the individual in GDR psychology at the end of the 60s. The individual no longer learned only by adapting to the environment as in the behaviorist approach, but by internalizing the norms and social requirements. Group discussions and other forms of conflict management, as we have, as Verena already talked about, were known to be the solution to interpersonal problems. The spread of these techniques shows a new form of influencing individuals. It was no longer the moralizing pressure from outside by party leaders or the collective, but the individual working on himself who was to solve the conflict in exchange with his fellow human beings. The potential incompatibility between love fulfillment and stable marriages, however, remained virulent. In 1975, the Berliner Zeitung had its reader to discuss whether love was enough for a happy marriage. Most of the replies printed by the editors then gave preference to the mature love, or pointed out that love must include other things than passion in a successful marriage. Thus, the spouses adopted a new marriage concept. However, there were dissenting voices. One woman complained about her husband in the column of the record, who did not engage with her in any way. I believe I can't live without love, which I don't understand in terms of sexual love. I've been missing a tender word or a gentle embrace for 3 years. Danuta Weber, another guidebook author, responded in a psychologizing and matter-of-fact manner, referring to mutual respect, advising the women to account for her own respect for her husband in order to bring about a different relationship in the long term. The partnership model represented an attempt to create a space for individual fulfillment, where love would have its place. However, the arguments about love in the 70s clearly show that these efforts were not always successful. The search for romantic fulfillment remained in conflict with a desire for stable marriages. I will come to the conclusion. In the 60s, in the GDR, politicians and family experts, as well as the controlled media, established partnership as a basic principle of marriage. This concept was part of a more open attitude towards marriage and family, which gave individuals more space, but at the same time, the model was also a new way of stabilizing marriages and containing tendencies to break up. Under the concept of partnership, mutual support in marriage was to offer room for personal development towards a socialist personality. This empowerment of individuals meant both professional fulfillment, but also realization in love in the partnership. This was a reaction to the increasing articulation of dissatisfaction of spouses and their longing for romantic love in their marriage. The idea of working on the relationship in order to avoid possible instability was central to the new concept. Working on the relationship was a concept that GDR marriage councils had already used earlier to stabilize marriages. Also known is the influence of the collective on people willing to divorce to achieve individual changes in behavior and thus save marriages. But now, under the idea of work on oneself, the development towards the socialist personality became a continuous task of self-management. These techniques were based on a new concept of the individual in GDR psychology. In contrast to behavioristic approaches, learning was no longer a process of mere adaptation, but of interiorization of norms and social demands. However, the new approach did not completely succeed in overcoming the conflict between individuals striving for self-realization in love and ensuring the stability of marriage. The adoption of new conflict strategy shows a shift away from moralizing pressure from outside to a psychologizing leadership that ultimately places responsibility in the hands of the individual being guided. The self was empowered, but at the same time more subtly subjected. The relationship between politics and the self changed from the domination of the private sphere to a more subtle form of influence, similar to those found in non-communist regimes of that time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the three panelists. So I open the discussion. Okay, so Adela first, then Melinda, and after that Florian, okay?
I would probably ask Frank Henschel and maybe also Lisa Dittrich for correction, because what I understood about the shift in the 1960s in socialist societies, specifically about Czechoslovakia, was that it turned slightly away from the original, partnership model of equal men and women toward a more traditional gender pattern. And it was exactly because of the child deprivation theory, which was in the Czechoslovak case used as a pressure on women, to be aware of the role. Because as far as I remember Matějček's text, he was never drawing these wonderful images of men taking care of children, but usually women. That's how I understood him as a conservative thinker, although of course he was using this progressive Western theory. And at the same time, the attack at female employment also came from the economic reform. You know, the 1960s and Schick's reform in Czechoslovakia was in fact also targeting female employment as something very expensive and not, you know, fulfilling the expected role. So that was the sense of crisis. Can you confirm that, or does your material actually show something different? I'm really asking as openly as that.
Thank you. A comment on the short question for Verena's presentation. I think there is a lot of parallel things between East German and Hungarian psychotherapy at that era. And my comment, I don't know if you know this journal. This is Studia Psychotherapeutica, the first issue, published in Budapest in 1978. And this was a fruit of the collaboration of socialist country. And this is a remark that the publication was composed in agreement with the psychotherapeutic work group of the socialist countries. And I made the interview with the organizers of psychotherapeutic weekend, and they told me there was a strong collaboration between East German and Hungarian group therapists. And this is a 3 languages journal. This was English, German, and Russian. And there is an article of Kurt, maybe this is K. Die Ausbildung von Gruppenpsychotherapeuten in der DDR. My pronunciation was not right. And there is 2 articles about the psychotherapeutic weekends, the Hungarian psychotherapeutic weekends. And my question is that the organizers of the psychotherapeutic weekends told me that the group psychotherapy in East Germany was not popular, but preferred by the party because it was easy to control by the Stasi. You can confirm this statement, and the individual psychotherapy was not preferred because of this opportunity. They couldn't control the individual therapies, but group therapy or that kind of training could be controlled by the party or the Stasi.
My question goes as well to Verena. I wanted to ask whether your material shows anything about the question to which degree did these theoreticians of this group therapy reflect differences to the Western group therapy. You showed that they were in contact, but they had another ideological goal. Or did they reflect this somehow, or did they just say, well, it's in the end about raising productivity like in the West, so it's the same? Or do you found anything about this?
Thank you very much. Maybe I take Jan's question first about if protagonists of the leadership training reflected upon differences. What can I say? Let me have a look. Yeah, maybe the first thing is that Vorwerk and his working group, or the trainers, the psychological trainers, were not psychotherapists. They were not working with people considered mentally ill, but with people considered healthy, and but at the same time they had no journal, for instance, to have this, to publish their work as a kind of human relations management theory or something like that. So what happened was, and I just came across that recently, that they published in the most important journal for psychotherapy, even if they were not psychotherapists. So the psychotherapists doing group psychotherapy in there's some work on Kurt Höck, and that's the person, Melinda, that you just mentioned. He was the one doing group psychotherapy, or one of the prominent figures at the Haus der Gesundheit in Berlin. Differences to Western group psychotherapy. So there is this difference. Yeah, I think the closest that leadership training gets is to so-called instrumented T groups in Western society, in the United States especially. Those are the interventions I think are that come the closest to the leadership training, because this was it was also not only about the group process, and that was not the only subject matter of these kind of training sessions, but they were instrumented as well in terms of real life problems. So the group was isolated, they weren't this cultural island like the traditional T group, but at the same time they were not left alone with the feelings towards each other alone. Yeah. But they had problems to work upon, and then but then nevertheless worked on an emotional level. So the group process was similar. And maybe one thing that I found interesting in the internal documents about a working group discussion, about 50 pages, about the theory of Moreno, which was deemed as incompatible with Marxism-Leninism. But a very common move that I find is to say, or to assume that you can separate the theory and the method. And I think there's even official statements by Vorwerk about that the theory is wrong, the theory is bad, but the method is valid, and the method can be adapted without introducing, for instance, liberal notions of self, autonomous self, not socially engaged.
Thank you, Adela, for this question. I think as far as I know, that the Czechoslovakian case is much more clearer to do the phases in towards the emancipation of women than the case of the GDR. As far as I know, the literature on the GDR, I've got the feeling there are some people who say there is a cut in the late 60s and the 70s with Honecker, with his new politics of the maternal leave, etc. But on the other hand, there is a tendency to say that the politics towards women emancipation was always utilitarian. And actually, when I see my material, I think the case is even more complicated, because one thing is if we look at the legal framework, and the other thing is when we look, for instance, at the media, which has been done, but not in such a broad sense. And I have the feeling that there we can sort of see that in the 50s, there's this idea that it will, with implementing the women into the labor market, the emancipation will just take place. And in the 60s, they suddenly realize, oh, it doesn't work that simple, because we have the problem of the household. And then there's this campaign launched, especially in the media, to the men's health. And then in the 70s, this sort of fades out, but still we can see this topic once and again in the women magazines, which is talked about, but it's not, there is no such educational campaign behind it anymore.
I think Christian Brenner wanted to say something.
I have a question to Lisa Dittrich. I really like your paper, and I think it makes a lot of sense to compare the GDR and Czechoslovakia, but I wanted to ask something about a part of your project you deliberately left out here in this presentation. And this is the comparison between the two Germanys. And you mentioned that in your larger project, you're working on both Germanys. And as we know, the competition between the two parts of the two Germanys was took place also in the field of gender and of sexuality. So I would be interested in to hear something about the tension between the claim of socialist states to be more progressive, also in aspects of also in the question of sexuality, that socialism with socialism liberation from old prejudices started and stuff like that on the one hand, and then on the other hand the distancing against sexual revolution in the West. So do these two topics, these two elements, play a role in your material?
I have a question to Frank, and I would like, I mean, there was Adela also had a question to Frank, and I would like to develop on this question without answering it, because it was a question to Frank. I just wanted to say that I would totally agree with you, Adela, that this child deprivation theory was part of this trend towards more traditional and unequal gender relations. But what is interesting is that then in the 80s, proponents of this deprivation theory like Maciej Langmeier, but also another person we didn't mention today is Maria Dąbrowska. She also was a proponent of this deprivation theory, and all these authors in the 80s were then or proposed to include men in childcare. So this is maybe also a thing we often forget, that these people also develop their ideas and see, maybe even realized what was the result of their theory in the late 50s and early 60s. So that they forgot the man and the father, and they developed their theory. And I have another question to Frank, but maybe it's also for Lisa, but especially to Frank, because you presented this transfer of knowledge, transfer of ideas from West to East. But I just wanted to know if you, I mean, I don't know if there was such a big cut between East and West, and if this was so much a transfer from West to East, or if it was more, if they considered themselves as part of an international community, because especially in the case of Maciej, I mean, he published in English, most of his work, the deprivation, but also others, were translated into English and in other languages. And also, I mean, we heard about Vorwerk or Hiebsch, in Eastern Germany, their works were translated not only into Czech, but also again in other languages. So I don't know if maybe they themselves didn't so much consider them as part of the East or West, but rather part of an international community of experts.
Peter, maybe we come back to the question to Lisa, and then I give the floor to Frank. And you have some time to prepare. Okay, Lisa.
Well, my question is going to be how this competition could have been seen in this whole negotiation in the DDR as well as in the West. For the West, West Germany, I still can't really tell you because I've not been looking into the sources that much. But in the DDR, as far as I can tell, there is this sometimes, not always, and it's not very prominent, but there is this idea of the progressive sexuality. But as we are tackling here marriages and problems, which is my focus, actually I have the feeling that they have the problems if they are too much progressive, then they can't solve these marriages which are breaking up. So it is not that common. That is my feeling in the first place now. And interestingly enough, the sexual revolution is not much, I really haven't come cross it. It's not really reflected in the letters or something like that. And as far as I've been looking through guidebooks, for instance, this is not a topic neither. So on this grassroots level, which is the main focus of my study, the comparison to West Germany is not as prominent as one could believe, and as we think of it as a classical German comparison. And just one sentence, last sentence to Peter for the question of transfer. I was actually asking myself the same question when I was listening to Verena before. If it's only like the Eastern countries receiving. As I'm looking at a different level for now, I want to go into the psych sciences more further on. It is not, I can't talk about the proper way that these psych sciences consider themselves, so I really can't say anything about that for now. But actually, I want to put the question to Verena, whether it is such a one-way way of transfer.
Now I give the floor to Frank, and then we'll come back to Verena because she didn't answer to all the questions.
Thank you. And Adela, your first question was also directed at me, I suppose. And yeah, you triggered a lot. I wrote a page down of keywords or so, but I will not be able to say all of this. But yeah, when I started this project on children's homes, I expected to learn something about how a socialist state wanted to care for children that could not live with their families, perhaps using some knowledge of pedagogy or psychology. And then it turned out to be such a huge prism, like sending beams of light to so many realms and fields of society, gender roles, family, modernization, the role of scientific knowledge, the governmentality of the regime during the decades. So my head is exploding. You are referring perhaps to the theory or the argument of Katarzyna Liszkova, who and others who said that, yeah, the traditional rollback of the 1970s of normalization was prepared in the liberal 1960s when Maciejczak and others, she also has a chapter about that, when Maciejczak promoted the traditional family, traditional role of mothers. And so I agree and I disagree because it's not only Maciejczak. There are so many experts. I just always refer to them as a anonymous group, but so many people that I read so many journals and articles and books that contribute to this discourse. Just when it's about adoption or foster care or something, they always talk about how should the family be, how should education for a child be, care for a child be. So what I would say in a few words is that the mother was always in the normatizing or normalizing focus of science, but also of state, what is it, the bureaucracy or the care provisions. In all files I was reading in the archives from so-called classifications homes, where the homes where children were first admitted to be examined by psychologists and to look at the family background and so. And it's always about the bad lifestyle of parents, especially of the mother. The mother's overburdened. Either she's working and that is bad because she can't take care of her children, or she's not working at all but roaming through bars at night or whatever. So it's always blaming of the mothers. They are always leading a bad life, and that all starts that goes on in the 1940s. So there is not really a caesura where we have a clearly socially realized new gender roles or understandings of how women should behave in relationships and partnerships and as mothers or so. But they were always in the focus. In the 1960s, I think the expertization and the psychologization of all this discourse, it really it provides some perhaps very convincing background for this to really argue. No, it's not just a moral standpoint, but we have scientific proof that mothers play such an important role, and that is Bowlby and Spitz and all the Western developmental psychology. They show this, and we also show this with our studies in children's homes. And I'm always talking about long-term residential care, like children's homes, really where babies were admitted and lived there for years. I'm not talking about daycare centers, kindergartens, or so. That's a different question. So this discourse is really old, and it's gendered. It's ethnicized. I haven't talked about this because Roma were, they became a problem, problematized also late 50s, early 60s. It was class specific, so to say, because the urban poor or the backward rural population was always a bigger problem. So in the end, I'm always thinking about, okay, there was a white middle class ideal also in socialist Czechoslovakia, perhaps, that was seen best for marriage, 2 children, and that was seen best for child development and also for socialist development of social personality later. There was no revolutionary proletarian ideal at all. But that brings me also to Peter's question or remark. Of course, I simplified so much it hurts. Of course, it was not like a transfer from west to east, but my original angle here was to show how Bowlby, who contradicts this socialist principles as far as we mostly know from a superficial understanding, how he contradicts this, but was adapted by psychologists in Czechoslovakia. But of course, they went to conferences, they published papers in German and also in English journals. Matějček was translated into German quite late in 1975, I think the first edition came out. But they were, of course, part of a transregional, so also in the East, in the Eastern Bloc, they were part of this discourse, but also in a trans-bloc discourse. And this is really true, and that's why I would really put this into the frame of a post-war, postmodern discourse, a shifting of governing families and childhood that is not really specifically socialist or Western democratic or whatever. But I really think the Scientizations, they approach each other, and they really fit each other, and they converge, and that's also a question that is driving me around here. So but thank you, you have given me so much input, and you understood what I was trying to say here. So I think this argument that I'm developing, and hopefully further also in publications, this will really elaborate.
I haven't answered the Stasi question yet. If the party leadership favored group psychotherapy over other forms of psychotherapy because the Stasi could easier control it, I simply cannot answer it. I don't know it. I could imagine that this has been the case. Because if you imagine there's a whole group of 20 people and there's only one informal, there's only one Stasi person in the room, then it's easier to report from it. The reasons that I know from the literature is that group psychotherapy is it's inexpensive. You can have 20 or 30 people in a room and may have effective relaxation methods, can give the service to lots of people. It's not as expensive. And then the whole notion of groups and the disciplining, or the how you call it, the effects of groups in terms of the socialist idea of socialist society, it matches much more than the single person therapy, I would say. The other question was transfer or circulation. I would strongly favor a global circulation of psychotechnologies. In my case, at least, I have referred to the instruction that Vorwerk gave and his later wife Traudl Alberg gave to social psychologists from Russia. And there's also sources evidencing that they have been instructing psychologists in other countries in Eastern Europe, and also in South America, in Mexico, in Cuba, and Colombia. So there you have a distribution of this kind of technique, this training technique, which has been inspired by Western sources, but at the same time has been adapted, modified, changed, and then distributed to other areas. And who knows what happened there with these technologies. So one thing that I'm interested in now, and what I also talked about a bit, is the theories that scholarship has developed mostly with Western sources and Western phenomena, if they have to be revisited now that we can see that these technologies have been applied in Eastern Europe as well, and especially with group techniques, because as you know, my question is, wasn't it really a kind of exaggeration to say that social psychology, everything social, everything which has to do with groups, is translating those features of democracy which are concerned with free individual, you know, the autonomous individual, or respect for autonomy, whereas we know from the history of social psychology and social psychology that Kurt Lewin and his colleagues developed, the experiments, that groups are very much social phenomena, and that the individual personality is inherently social, you know, which seems to match very much with the Marxist conception of individuals in society. So yeah, that is a bit, you know, the questions I'm struggling with.
Okay, so thank you to the three panelists. Since I have the floor, I want to thank again everybody, and especially Jakub for what he did.